Fort de la River, Fort de la Riverie au Boeuf, otherwise known as just Fort LeBoeuf, which is how I'm going to be saying it because I butchered the crap out of that, was a French fort established on a fork of the French Creek River in what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania. It was part of a defensive line known as Fort Presqu'Isle, Fort Mahault, and Fort Duquesne. It was located about 15 miles from the shores of Lake Erie on the shores of LeBoeuf Creek. The French portage supplies and trade goods from Lake Erie overland to Fort LeBoeuf, where they traveled by canoe or raft down French Creek to the Allegheny, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers. Captain Paul Marin de la Malgue began construction on July 11, 1753. Jacques Legadeur de Saint-Pierre began command of the fort on December 3rd, 1753. This fort was the second in a series of posts that the French built between spring 1753 and summer 1754 to assert their hold over the Ohio country. These ran along Lake Erie to the forks of the Ohio. They represented the last links to connect French Canada and the French colonies on the Gulf Coast. They seized the British trading post occupied by Scotsman John Fraser, at the Linpomp village of Venango, at the junction of French Creek and the Allegheny River, currently Franklin, Pennsylvania, which is much easier to say if it hadn't been obvious. Leaving a force to garrison the new post, the command returned to Canada. By the way, this is going to be rough because I don't speak French. Fort LeBoeuf guarded the southern end of the Venango Path, the portage road between Lake Erie and French Creek mentioned earlier. It served as a French trading post and garrison until 1759, when the capture of Fort Niagara forced them to abandon Ohio. Jumping back to 1753, Governor of Virginia, still a British colony at the time, Robert Dinwiddie, which is somehow even more weird to say, despite it being an English name, sent a 21-year-old major in the Virginia militia to Fort LeBoeuf, one George Washington. Washington took explorer Christopher Gist along as his guide, and Gist saved him on 2 occasions, and he arrived at Fort LeBoeuf on December 11, 1753. Commander de Saint-Pierre, himself a tough veteran of what was then the wild American West of Ohio, received Washington politely but contemptuously. A la Admiral Jean Soule, though this time with a massive British task force not sitting outside, he was able to reject the governor's sent ultimatum. The French commander provided Washington with 3 days' rest and hospitality at the fort and gave a return message to Dinwiddie. The letter ordered the governor to deliver the demands to the French Major General of New France in Quebec City. During his stay, Washington noted the fort had 100 men, numerous officers, birch canoes, and 70 pine canoes, many unfinished. He described the fort as on a south or west fork of the French Creek near the Warrer. During his stay, Washington noted that the fort had 100 men, numerous officers, birch canoes, and about 70 pine canoes, many of which were unfinished. He described the fort as on the south or west fork of the French Creek near the water and almost surrounded by it. 4 houses composed the sides. The bastions were made of piles driven into the ground 12 feet high and sharpened at the top. Portholes for cannons and small arms were cut into each bastion. Each mounted 8 6-pounder cannons and 1 4-pounder guarding the gate. Inside the bastion stood a guardhouse, chapel, doctor's lodging, and commander's private stores. Outside the fort were several log barracks, some covered in bark, some in board, along with stables, a smithy, and other buildings. The outbreak of the American theater of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, which paradoxically began before the rest of the 7 Years' War. In fact, most of the 7 Years' War was a result of the French and Indian War. Welcome to mid-18th century politics. On May 28, 1754, with the Battle of Jumonville Glen, 4 years later, the French surrendered the fort at Fort Niagara, and during August of 1759, the commander of Fort Presqu'Isle sent an order to Fort LeBoeuf and Fort Mahault for the officers and troops to abandon their positions and move north. Before they left, they burned the forts to make them unsuitable for the British. It seems the French hadn't considered the British would rebuild the forts. renaming at least some of the forts as well. During Pontiac's rebellion on June 18, 1763, after the Seven Years' War, a war party of Native Americans burned the fort. The survivors escaped to Fort Venango, formerly Fort McCall, but it was also burned, so they went to Fort Pitt, which was formerly Fort Duquesne. Jumping way ahead to 1794 saw Major Ebenezer Denny of the United States Army report to Governor Thomas Mifflin from the fort. He described the fort with 4 blockhouses manned by riflemen. The 2 rear blockhouses had 6-pounder cannons on the second floor, as well as swivel guns over the gates. This would be the 3rd nationality to lay claim to this fort. When Judge Vincent settled in Waterford in 1797, however, he wrote, "There are no remains of the old French fort excepting the traces on the ground." And that's all I've got for you today. Hope you enjoyed. Sorry to all my viewers who speak French. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.